AITAH for erasing my husband's existence after finding out he used my SSN to buy his mistress a house and fund a second family. It started with a $4.99 charge at a Sunny Days daycare in a town 3 hours away. I'm a senior data analyst. I live in spreadsheets and patterns. My husband David is a traveling consultant for a logistics firm. We don't have children. When I saw the charge on our joint credit card, I assumed it was a clerical error, a glitch in the matrix. I called the daycare, expecting a quick apology. Instead, the woman on the other end said, "Oh, hi, Sarah. Little Toby forgot his lunchbox again yesterday. David said he'd bring it by this morning." My blood didn't run cold. It turned into liquid nitrogen. I wasn't just Sarah Miller, David's wife of 7 years. I was Sarah Miller, the name on the emergency contact list for a child I didn't know existed. I didn't confront him that night. I sat across from him at dinner, watching him chew his steak, marveling at the sheer structural integrity of his lies. "Hard day at the office, honey?" I asked, my voice steady. "Brutal," he sighed. "Logistics is a nightmare right now." Went to our home office after he fell asleep. I didn't look for a hidden phone. I looked for his digital shadow. I tracked the IP addresses of his work logins. They weren't coming from corporate headquarters. They were coming from a residential neighborhood in Oak Grove, the same town as the daycare. I checked my own credit report and felt a sharp pain in my chest. There was a mortgage for a house in Oak Grove. My name was on the deed as a cosigner. My social security number had been used to build a nest for a woman named Elena and a boy named Toby. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focus. I realized that if I divorced him now, he would walk away with half of our marital assets and likely stick me with the debt of the Oak Grove house. But David had made a fatal mistake. He had used my identity to secure his secrets. In the eyes of the law and the bank, I was the primary owner of his second life. I began the identity audit. I didn't want to just leave him. I wanted to delete the version of him that existed at my expense. I opened a private, encrypted cloud drive and began uploading every forged signature, every diverted paycheck, and every fraudulent loan application he had ever made. I needed to see her. I drove to Oak Grove on a Friday while David was at a conference in Chicago. I parked a block away from the address on the mortgage. The house was charming, a blue Craftsman with a white picket fence. I saw her come out to get the mail. Elena. She was younger, softer, wearing a sweatshirt that belonged to David. She looked happy. She looked like she believed in the man I used to know. I realized she wasn't the villain. She was just another line item in David's fraud. He was using my credit to buy her happiness and my salary to pay for her security. I sat in my car, my hands gripped tight on the steering wheel. I wasn't going to destroy her. I was going to reclaim my name. The first step of the audit was financial redirection. David's consulting. Paychecks were direct deposited into an account he thought I didn't see. But as the primary on our family's master account, I had once set up an auto sweep for emergency savings. I logged into the bank portal and adjusted the sweep parameters. Instead of taking 10%, I set it to take 90% of any deposit over $1,000, redirecting it into a new private offshore account in my name only. I labeled the transfer regulatory fee internal. To David, it would look like a corporate tax or a payroll error. He was so arrogant about my cluelessness, with money that he didn't even check his stubs. He just saw the final balance and assumed life was getting more expensive. David had listed Elena and Toby as beneficiaries on a private life insurance policy, a policy paid for by our joint household account. I called the provider, posing as the doting wife, updating our records. Since I was the one who had originally opened the policy during our first year of marriage, I was the sole owner. I didn't remove Elena. I did something better. I changed the triggering event to include a clause for legal dissolution or fraudulent misrepresentation. If David was ever found guilty of a felony, the entire cash value of the policy would be liquidated and paid out to me. I was essentially betting on his own downfall. I knew David was skimming from his company's travel budget to pay for his double life. I sent an anonymous tip to his firm's compliance department from a burner email. I didn't give them everything, just enough to trigger an internal review of his Oak Grove expenses. I knew David would try to hide the evidence on his work laptop. What he didn't know was that I had installed a keylogger on it weeks ago under the guise of updating his antivirus. I watched in real time as he scrambled to delete files. I saved copies of everything he deleted. Every hiding move he made was just more evidence for my folder. David's entire social standing was built on the sterling husband persona. I began a subtle campaign of social erasure. I accidentally forgot to pay the dues for his private club from our joint account. I misplaced the RSVP for his boss's daughter's wedding. I started telling our mutual friends that David was struggling with some personal health issues and needed space. I was isolating him, pulling him out of the social fabric that gave him his power. I wanted him to be a ghost before he even realized he was dead. The Oak Grove mortgage was the biggest problem. I didn't want the house, but I didn't want the credit hit. I found a loophole in the power of attorney. David had once convinced me to sign for our estate planning. I used that same POA to transfer the Oak Grove debt into a new LLC, Reynolds Logistics, LLC, which I then sold to a shell company owned by my offshore account. In simple terms, I made David's secret house the property of my secret company. He was now effectively paying rent to me, his wife, without knowing it. The audit was nearly complete. I owned his home, his debt, and his future. It's our 7th anniversary tomorrow. David has planned a quiet dinner at home, claiming he's too tired for a restaurant. I know why. say he's broke, his accounts are empty, his firm is breathing down his neck, and his mistress is asking why the vacation fund is gone. He thinks he's going to spend the evening gaslighting me into loaning him $50,000 from my inheritance to invest in a new project. He thinks I'm the ATM. He doesn't know that when he wakes up tomorrow, his key won't work, his car will be gone, and Sarah Miller will no longer exist in his world. The table was set with the precision of a crime scene. I had prepared David's favorite meal, a dry-aged ribeye and a bottle of vintage Cabernet. I dressed in the silk gown he'd bought me for our 5th anniversary, the one he'd paid for with a credit card he'd opened in my name without telling me. As I lit the candles, I felt a strange, cold clarity. This was the last time I would ever sit across from this man. I checked my phone one last time. The automated scripts I had written were set to execute at 8 p.m. The bank accounts, the digital access codes, the professional credentials, they were all scheduled for deactivation. David walked through the door at 7:15 p.m., looking tired and carrying a bouquet of cheap grocery store roses. He didn't know that those roses were the last thing he would ever be able to afford. "Happy anniversary, Sarah," he said, kissing my cheek. I felt a phantom shiver of disgust, but I smiled. We sat down and the small talk began. He talked about his hectic week in Chicago, a city he hadn't actually visited, according to his GPS logs. He was laying the groundwork for his ask. He started talking about a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity in logistics that required an immediate $50,000 cash injection. "I know your inheritance is sitting in that trust, Sarah. It's just wasting away. If you let me manage it, I can triple it by next year. We could finally buy that vacation home you've always wanted." He looked so sincere. It was the look of a professional con artist who had started to believe his own script. I took a slow sip of wine and watched the clock. 7:45 p.m. As David was mid-sentence about synergy and market growth, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, frowning. It was an alert from his firm's IT department. His remote access to the corporate VPN had been terminated due to security irregularities. He laughed it off. "Just a server glitch, honey. They're probably doing maintenance." He tried to continue, but his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Elena. I saw the preview on the screen. "David, the mortgage check bounced. The bank says the account is closed." Toby is crying. "Where are you?" David's face went from a healthy tan to a sickly mottled gray. He excused himself to the hallway, his voice a frantic whisper. I stayed at the table cutting my steak. At exactly 8 p.m., I heard David's frantic tapping on his phone from the hallway. "What do you mean, access denied?" he hissed into the receiver.
He didn't realize that.
I had used my admin access to our joint carrier plan to port his number to a virtual SIM on my laptop. To the world, David's phone was now a dead brick. He ran back into the dining room, his eyes wide. "Sarah, something is wrong. My phone is dead, my cards are being declined, and I can't get into my work email. I think I've been hacked." I put down my fork and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. "You haven't been hacked, David," I said calmly. "You've been audited." I pulled a tablet from under my chair and turned it toward him. On the screen was a dashboard I had built, the identity audit. It showed a map of Oak Grove, a photo of the blue Craftsman house, and a scanned copy of the mortgage he'd forged my name on. Below that was a scrolling list of every dollar he'd stolen from me over the last 7 years. "Who is Toby, David? And why am I paying for his daycare?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the room. He didn't try to deny it. He didn't have the data to support a lie. He just stood there, looking at the screen, realizing that the clueless wife had been his primary investigator for months. "Sarah, I can explain," he started. The classic opening line of a man with no explanation. Before he could continue, my laptop chimed. It was an email from his firm's chief compliance officer. Because I had helpfully forwarded the evidence of his expense fraud an hour ago, the firm had officially terminated him for cause and was preparing a criminal referral for embezzlement. "You're not just broke, David," I said. "You're unemployed, and your firm is currently filing a police report regarding the $150,000. You are located from the Chicago logistics project." I believe the term they used was grand larceny. David sank into his chair, his hands shaking. "The Oak Grove house, Elena and the baby, you can't just throw them out." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register. "I'm not throwing them out. I'm their landlord. Remember the LLC I showed you? Reynolds Logistics? I own it. I bought the mortgage you defaulted on. Elena has already been served with an informational disclosure. She knows everything. She knows about me. She knows about your business trips. And she's already agreed to testify against you in exchange for staying in the house for 6 months, rent-free while she finds a new life." David tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to give way. "I'll sue you. You can't just take my money." I laughed. "What money, David? The account you used to pay for Elena's car was in my name. The car is now in my name. The credit you used to buy your consultant suits? Canceled. Your social security number has been flagged for identity theft protection by me. You can't even open a library card right now without a secondary verification code that goes to my phone." I was erasing him in real time. He was becoming a man with no digital footprint, no credit, and no home. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single heavy envelope. "This is your anniversary gift. He opened it with trembling fingers. It wasn't just divorce papers. It was a restitution agreement. It stipulated that he would sign over all future earnings, any remaining personal property, and waive all rights to marital assets in exchange for me not handing the forgery files to the district attorney tonight. You have 10 minutes to sign it before I hit send on the final email to the Oak Grove Police Department. He looked at the papers, then at me. He saw no mercy. He saw a data analyst who had finally balanced the books. David signed. He had no choice. He was a man with no cards left to play. I stood up, picked up my purse, and walked to the front door. The locks have already been changed on the house in Oak Grove, and the locks on this house will be changed in exactly 15 minutes. Your clothes are in 2 trash bags at the end of the driveway. As I walked out into the cool night air, I heard him start to sob. I didn't look back. The identity audit was complete. I was no longer a victim of his fraud. I was the owner of his ruin. I got into my car, the one I had paid for with my own hard-earned money, and drove toward a life where my name finally belonged to me again. The first morning of my new life was remarkably quiet. I woke up in a hotel suite I'd booked under my maiden name, Sarah Thorne. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't check David's location on my phone. I didn't have to. I knew exactly where he was, homeless, penniless, and officially a person of interest in a corporate embezzlement case. I sat by the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the city wake up. My inbox was a battlefield of automated alerts I had set up. David had tried to use his emergency credit card at a motel at 3:15 a.m. It had been declined. He had tried to log into his hidden Bitcoin wallet. The 2-factor authentication code had come to my laptop, and I had promptly changed the password. I wasn't just observing his failure. I was managing it. I spent the morning meeting with my legal team. We filed the signed restitution agreement and the divorce petition simultaneously. My lawyer, a shark named Marcus, was impressed. I've seen bitter divorces, Sarah, but I've never seen someone legally unperson their spouse before the first hearing. He explained that because David had used my SSN for the Oak Grove mortgage, we could argue identity theft to have the debt wiped from my personal credit while keeping the property under the LLC I controlled. I was effectively pruning the dead branches of David's fraud while keeping the soil fertile for myself. But there was one loose end, Elena. I hadn't just audited a man, I had audited a family. And Toby, a 3-year-old boy who shared David's eyes, was a variable I couldn't simply delete. I drove to Oak Grove that afternoon. I didn't want to hide in my car this time. I walked up the path of the blue craftsman house and knocked on the door. When Elena opened it, she looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was clutching a cordless phone as if it were a weapon. She recognized me instantly from the informational disclosure I'd sent. "You're her," she whispered. "I'm the woman whose name is on your birth certificate's emergency contact in your mortgage," I said, my voice calm. "Can I come in?" We sat at her kitchen table, a table David had bought with our anniversary fund 3 years ago. She told me everything. David had told her I was a wealthy, eccentric aunt who managed his finances because he was too busy with global logistics. He had told her that we were partners in an estate planning venture. He had built a labyrinth of lies so complex that she truly believed she was living a legitimate life. "I didn't know, Sarah. I swear to God I didn't know you were his wife," she sobbed. I looked at her and saw the version of myself from 7 years ago, trusting, hopeful, and completely oblivious to the predator in the house. I realized then that David wasn't just a thief of money, he was a thief of time. He had stolen 7 years from me and 4 from her. I handed her a tissue and a business card for a family law attorney I had already retained on her behalf. "I'm not here to take the house from you, Elena. I'm here to help you sue David for everything he has left, which isn't much, but it's justice." By the end of the first week, David had reached the desperation stage of the narcissist's collapse. Since he couldn't access his money or his phone, he did the only thing he had left. He showed up at my office. He managed to slip past the lobby security by claiming he was delivering an urgent legal package. When he burst into my office, he looked unrecognizable. His designer suit was wrinkled and stained, his hair was greasy, and there was a frantic, wild look in his eyes that made me instinctively reach for the silent alarm under my desk. "You think you're so smart, Sarah," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You think you can just take my life? I made you. You were nothing before I met you. I was a woman with a clean credit score and a soul." "David," I replied, standing up slowly, "you're the one who turned into a ghost." He lunged across the desk, grabbing for my laptop, likely thinking that if he could just delete the audit files, his problems would vanish. But I had anticipated this. The laptop on my desk was a decoy, a machine, with no local storage and a BIOS-level lock that triggered a silent call to the police the moment an unauthorized peripheral was attached. As he struggled with the machine, the office doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers stepped in. They didn't even have to ask what was happening. David was already on the trespass and restraining order list I had distributed to building security. As they handcuffed him, he looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "I'll tell everyone what you did. You're a psycho." "Go ahead, David," I said as they led him away. "But remember, to tell them, you'll need to admit to the forgery first." The audit moved from the civil to the criminal phase. The logistics firm David worked for didn't just fire him, they went for blood. Because I had provided them with the keylogger logs, showing David's deliberate manipulation of the Chicago project funds. The district attorney had enough for an indictment of grand larceny and wire fraud. I sat in a sterile room at the precinct giving my statement. I laid out the identity audit as a defensive measure. I showed them how David had systematically used my personal information to create a fraudulent ecosystem. The lead detective, a veteran who had seen every type of domestic fraud imaginable, whistled as he flipped through my binder. Most people just change their passwords and cry, Ms. Miller. You built a federal case. He didn't just steal money, detective. He tried to replace my life with a fake one, I explained. I was just restoring the original settings. By that evening, David was officially charged. Because he had no assets to post bail. Every account he'd ever touched was either frozen, drained, or legally transferred into my LLC. He was remanded to custody. The man who lived in high-rise, hotels, and private jets was now sleeping on a cot in a 6x9 cell. The audit was no longer just a digital exercise. It was a physical reality. I began the process of liquidating the marital estate. I sold the house we had lived in for 7 years. I didn't want to live in a place where every corner reminded me of a lie. I sold the furniture, the cars, and the investments David had supposedly made on my behalf. I kept only my personal journals and the data server. The proceeds from the sale were massive. Combined with the repatriated funds from David's secret accounts, I had more wealth than I had ever imagined. But it wasn't wealth to me. It was a restitution fund. I set aside a significant portion into a protected educational trust for Toby. The boy was innocent, and I refused to let him pay for his father's sins with a life of poverty. I invited Elena to the signing of the trust documents. Why are you doing this? She asked, looking at the figure on the paper. After everything he did to you? Because David wanted us to be enemies, I said. He wanted us to fight over the scraps while he sat at the head of the table. By taking care of Toby, I'm making sure David never has a seat at that table again. News of the identity audit spread through our social circles like a wildfire. The people who had once admired David as a powerhouse consultant were now scrambling to distance themselves. I received dozens of messages, some apologetic, some voyeuristic. I ignored most of them. I wasn't interested in the gossip. I was interested in the closure. I hosted a small gathering for my closest friends, the ones who had seen me through the fog years. We didn't talk about the scandal. We talked about the future. I told them I was leaving the data analysis firm to start my own consultancy, Identity Shield. I wanted to use my skills to help other victims of domestic financial abuse. I had found a new purpose in the wreckage of my marriage. I wasn't just Sarah Miller anymore. I was a protector of the truth. The trial was a mere formality, facing the mountain of evidence I had provided, forgeries, digital trails, and the testimony of both his wives. David's lawyers pushed for a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. I stood in the courtroom on the day of his sentencing. I wore a bright, sharp red suit. I wanted him to see me as a beacon of his failure. When I was allowed to give my victim impact statement, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I read from my ledger. David Reynolds didn't just steal money, I told the judge. He tried to weaponize my own name against me. He tried to turn my identity into a shield for his greed. He assumed that because I loved him, I would never look at the numbers. He was wrong. The numbers are the only thing that doesn't lie. David was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 10 years of supervised release and a permanent restitution order. As he was led away, he looked at me, and for the first time I saw no fire in his eyes. Just the empty, hollow stare of a man who realized he had been deleted. With the trial over, I focused on helping Elena transition. We worked together to sell the Blue Craftsman house. It was a beautiful home, but it was built on a foundation of fraud. We used the equity to help her buy a small condo in a town where no one knew the name. David Reynolds. We became a strange kind of family, bound not by blood, but by the shared experience of surviving a predator. Toby started to call me Auntie Sarah. It was a title I wore with pride. It was a reminder that even in the most calculated audits, there is room for human connection. I watched Elena start a job as a paralegal, her confidence growing every day. We had both been audited by life, and we had both come out in the black. I hosted a small gathering for my closest friends, the ones who had seen me through the fog years. We didn't talk about the scandal. We talked about the future. I told them I was leaving the data analysis firm to start my own consultancy, Identity Shield. I wanted to use my skills to help other victims of domestic financial abuse. I had found a new purpose in the wreckage of my marriage. I wasn't just Sarah Miller anymore. I was a protector of the truth. The trial was a mere formality, facing the mountain of evidence I had provided, forgeries, digital trails, and the testimony of both his wives. David's lawyers pushed for a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft. I stood in the courtroom on the day of his sentencing. I wore a bright, sharp red suit. I wanted him to see me as a beacon of his failure. When I was allowed to give my victim impact statement, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I read from my ledger. David Reynolds didn't just steal money, I told the judge. He tried to weaponize my own name against me. He tried to turn my identity into a shield for his greed. He assumed that because I loved him, I would never look at the numbers. He was wrong. The numbers are the only thing that doesn't lie. David was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison prison, followed by 10 years of supervised release and a permanent restitution order. As he was led away, he looked at me, and for the first time I saw no fire in his eyes, just the empty, hollow stare of a man who realized he had been deleted. With the trial over, I focused on helping Elena transition. We worked together to sell the Blue Craftsman house. It was a beautiful home, but it was built on a foundation of fraud. We used the equity to help her buy a small condo in a town where no one knew the name. David Reynolds. We became a strange kind of family, bound not by blood, but by the shared experience of surviving a predator. Toby started to call me Auntie Sarah. It was a title I wore with pride. It was a reminder that even in the most calculated audits, there is room for human connection. I watched Elena start a job as a paralegal, her confidence growing every day. We had both been audited by life, and we had both come out in the black.